day. Yeah, please take your seats. You don't have to fasten your seatbelts. But be ready for two talks. As the first speaker would be, the first talk will be delivered by Jacques Poulain, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Paris VIII and is holder of UNESCO Chair of Philosophy of Culture and Institutions. After having taught at the University of Montreal from 1968 to 1985, he was Vice President of the College International of Philosophy in the period from 1985 to 1992. These works include L'âge pragmatique, l'expérimentation totale, la loi de vérité de l'homme, les éléments d'anthropobiologie philosophique du langage, du noyau moderne, and from 2017, Peut-on guérir de la mondialisation? He coordinates in collaboration with Bruno Cami, the research group of transcultural studies, which is related to Université Paris VIII, the publishing house Armatong. And for the moment, the today's lecture is entitled "Philosophy as an Aesthetics of Happiness." Soyez bienvenue, Professor. The floor is yours for now.
Thank you first to Bodegon Douaré for inviting me to speak to you. And I will follow his tracks about Oswald Andrade and come back to two sentences of Oswald Andrade. Before the Portuguese discovered Brazil, Brazil discovered happiness. I think that he was right, and that your culture of happiness is well known universally, and it will me allow to dare what us cannot say in other years, because I am in sympathy with this culture of happiness. And the second sentence is more aphoristic, and I will have the duty to explain to you. Joy is the proof, the nine proof, that is confirming the true description of what human being is. And I have no right to error, and I will be very thankful when you pose some questions that I could discover somehow. I will begin by the prosopopeia as a hedonic source of happiness. The contemporary anthropology of language has completely upset the benchmarks of aesthetics. By retracing the dynamics of communication at the base of our experience, it has shown that the chronic abortive being, that is the human being in order to be able to live, has to attach oneself to language by making the word speak forward, to find there the same happiness that he had taken from listening to the voice of the mother in intrauterine listening, as Alfred Tomatis discovered. Because the human being is not a biological well-formed being, and was born a year too early compared to mammals of similar complexity, is only endowed with intraspecific instincts, nutritional, sexual, and defensive. He therefore needs to invent his visual perception, his physical action, and his consummatory action by projecting the harmony between the sounds that he emits and receives in his relationship with the world, with his fellow human beings, and with himself. The use of language was called prosopopeia by William von Humboldt to make it clear that the way in which poets and playwrights make the world, stones, springs, animals speak in their poem or in their plays, did not constitute only an artistic process derived from the use of language, but that it presented itself quite the contrary, as the process of original use of language, as the source of dialogue and of art. In this way, we also discovered that our life it was exclusively a dialogue. The human child has to make the world speak by using this prosopopeia to be able to perceive it with his own eyes. Much more, it must feel this perception as a response from the world itself, as a response which can be felt as favorable as the voice of its mother heard when it was in her womb. The child experiences this harmony in an animistic way in his use of sounds because of its inability to perceive a difference between the sounds he emits and those it then hears. Also, it lends its heard sound to the world with which it identifies itself for the same reason. It is the source of a link developed with the sacred in human sensibility, that is to say, the source of a sacred prosopopeia revered in the various religions. Arnold Bellet's anthropobiyology confirmed this linguistic hypothesis. This audiophonic harmony lends its own law to the dynamics of imagination of our thought and our desires in the following way. Every hiatus and every disharmony with the world, with others and with ourselves, must be overcome by projecting a new form of pre-harmony with the world, with others and with ourselves. This occurs according to the pattern of harmonization of the sounds emitted and heard and of the dialogue. As we spontaneously pre-harmonize by ear the sound we emit with the same sound we try to hear, we pre-harmonize our perception, action, and desire with the most favorable responses we can expect from the world, others, and ourselves. This prosopopeia indeed functions as a faculty to create the feeling of beauty as well as of happiness. Because access to perception is always filtered by the world we project into the world, to isolate objects and identify them with what we see of them using our predicates, we experience the verbal activity of this perception as a response as favorable as our sounds when we listen to them. The child makes the world speak when it itself emits a sound, then attributing his own phonic power to the visual world, to be able to see this world, thus transforming his vision into a consummatory act of perception, converting aggressive sensation into gratifying perceptions. It links the gratification felt in listening to the world with the joys it feels in seeing it. It thus comes to perceive the world as an entity that speaks to him, projecting into the world the privileged access to communication that it shared with his mother, and since its mother response were felt to be rewarding, it comes to perceive this visual world that speaks to him as the speaker of a positive answer, expressing simultaneously both and its need and the way to meet it. This movement allows it to produce an effective reversal of its impulses. Instead of perceiving stimuli requiring a physical reaction on its part and being projected toward the appropriate consummatory action, it transforms the visual perceptual stimulus likened to the sounds image in a pure consummatory action of itself. It transforms its visual sensation into a consummatory and rewarding visual perception. The dynamic of this prosopia is therefore capable of being transferred into any perception, and so transferring its power of enjoyment there. This transference necessarily has a double impact. It is used to enable us to perceive that we perceive what we perceive, as well as to rejoice in what we rejoice in as an effective reality. The impossibility we feel of living the enjoyment of this enjoyment allows us to select the experiences that we call being that of natural beauty. Because this inversion of a biological circuits which characterize the use of the voice can be transferred to any sensible experience, because the use of listening to our songs underlies any use of our five senses. This articulation of a sense of reality to the experience of enjoying it is itself transferred to the use of these five senses. This gives us a key to understand what the Greeks called aesthesis, the regulation of our life, which is assumed by the experience of listening to ourselves, to others, and to the world, is therefore not restricted to the audio-phonological experience of itself, but it also animates the use of each of our five senses. It is also the source of all creative imaginations and makes it a dialogical imagination. Much more, it transfers itself as a creative capacity not only in artistic creation, but also in the use of our five senses. It makes our life a dialogue with the world, with our fellow human beings, as well as with ourselves. We seek a world that responds to our expectation as gratifyingly as our mother's voice, and this multifunctional response of words to our sounds are what in turn allow us to attune ourselves to that world. This audio-phonological dynamic even makes possible the experience of thinking. It means of creating what we call our mental life. To think of a past perception is to listening to ourselves and to rejoice in the self-enjoyment that we rejoice in when we made our sensations speak as visual perception. But this time, without having to visually perceive this perception or the object of which we are thinking. We can only access any reality whatsoever because we rejoice in this reality by making it speak. The use of language makes all perceptions possible because the structure of agreement between the propositional subject and its predicate is projecting into it to make it recognize that to exist for the name reality is effectively to be what we consume of it by the use of the propositional predicate. It means by identifying this object with its property denoted by this predicate. In the example most used by logicians, the snow is white, the thought of this proposition or its expressive use transform the received and external sensation because the identification of the thing called snow is produced in it to what we perceive of it, that is to say its property. It is identified with this property by the use of the predicate white. To be able to be thought to, the proposition describing a perception must trigger by its reception its own understanding as the unique consummatory action of itself accompanied by this perception. Instead of triggering a mechanical reaction as happens in any instinctive biological circuit, the perception that is made possible using a proposition only triggers as a reaction the consummatory action of its reality and of its truth. Every use of a proposition is indeed anthropophagic in the sense given to this word by Oswald de Andrade. We are condemned to consume the mime of the mother's voice that we project. This hedonic component is operative in the activation of audiophonic sensibility, but it is itself transformed into cultural eudaimonia through this filter of truth. This is what remains true of the Kantian doctrine, in which Kant called transcendental truth this movement of thought which he conceived as the anticipation of truth conditioning access to any reality whatsoever. But Kant conceived it as an a priori datum of reflection, as if it constituted a magical event within us. He was then completely unaware that the use of the reality principle and that of the pleasure principle are inextricably linked in any perceptual experience, where one thus produces both an happiness of truth and an happiness of life. The artistic experience finds its own specific dynamic in the search for all the experiments of the world and of others will respond to us in a way as favorable as the voice of our mother. The dialogical specificity of the arts emerges in the different arts in the form of the different way of producing and recognizing the different happinesses that we seek in our life to overcome any hiatus. What characterizes artistic beauty is the inscription in works of art of the human capacity to produce the happiness of life to which the use of speech and dialogue give access. When we separate the specific creativity of art from its origin, that is, from the use of language, it seems irretrievably mysterious. It appears as a natural miracle, emerging fortuitously from a brilliant imagination, capable of seeing the world for unknown reason in a different way that we usually see it. The harmonization of the world by using words and propositions transfers its own law to the dynamic of imagination, thought, and desire in the following way. To overcome a hiatus and disharmony with the world, we pre-harmonize our perception, actions, and desire as the way in which we make the world and our interlocutor speak to us in the most favorable way. This pre-harmonization already inhabits every use of a proposition. The cognitive and logical pre-harmonization, which carries the proposition by which we objectify perception, action, thoughts, feelings, and desire, is always the same. We are incapable of thinking a proposition without thinking that this proposition is true. Expressed in the words of Charles Sanders Peirce, every proposition asserts its own truth. In our own terms, we must think our proposition as true in order to be able to objectify the visual facts that correspond to them, as well as our physical actions or our desires. It is necessary to produce the only relation to reality that we can gain, that is, to recognize in a perception of a visual fact what allows this fact to exist. It is also necessary to perceive our physical action as both real and objective. It means to be able to choose it as an action that has to become a reality. All our relations with the world, others, and ourselves cannot therefore be produced or completed without judging whether this pre-harmonized linguistic collection, which are shown in our proposals, show us or not the objective condition of life that they are presumed to be shown in order to come into existence. As addresses of ourselves, we need to know first whether we ourselves are in harmony with this different, with ourselves as speaker or as speaking beings, and second, whether we ourselves are in harmony with these different realities. Our relations with ourselves are therefore necessarily indirect. We cannot judge and transform ourselves without judging the objectivity of the experience of speech or thought that guarantee this relationship as these experiences. We cannot gratify ourselves and be in harmony with ourselves and with our adversary without judging the truth of the proposition expressing our knowledge, our needs to act, and our desire. This law of truth also governs and validates our use of dialogue. And proceed and try to explain the prosopopeia of speech acts in a philosophical aesthetics of dialogue. It is enough to know the cognitive and hedonic dynamics of our dialogical creativity to understand that we can only speak to our listener by projecting the dynamic of prosopopeia in the use of speech acts. We cannot talk to our adversary without taking this point of view. It is not necessary in order to explain it, to recall the second Kantian maxim, according to which we must take the point of view of our partner to widen our view of the world, because we already take this point of view, but we are not at all in the process of following a maxim. We only follow a law that is already constitutive of our use of language and our dialogical imagination. It is followed constitutionally by the interlocutor. We cannot do otherwise. We can only imagine the state of after the action of a desire about which we speak or who speaks to ourselves, to others, as response, but response to them or respond to us in the most favorable and gratifying way, meaning the presumed voice of our mother. Because dialogue gives us as interlocutor the ability to objectively judge the objectivity of the harmony that we create there as an agreement with others and with ourselves. Each speech act makes us dependent on the response of our adversary. Neither the morality of consensus nor the legislative politics of public opinion can impose it on us without blocking access to the mutual and common happiness which our dialogical second nature seeks in each dialogue. We can easily apply to our agreement of truth what we have learned about the affirmation of a descriptive proposition of perception by applying it to essay speech acts themselves. Contrary to the conventionalist and pragmatist description given by John Austin, and contrary to John Searle's reduction of them to contractual promises, it is necessary to take the dynamic of truth in the sound and the thought and the speech acts much more seriously than we do. Indeed, we define the speech acts as the only act that it is suffice to designate in order to perform them, which means that we define them by a sort of magical and reflexive character that we derive from the self-referential meaning. But the dynamics of our prosopopeia obliges us to recognize, on the contrary, that the speech acts must and can be redescribed as affirmation. When we say, I affirm that P is true, the statement can be reconstructed as P is as true as I say that it is, and that the fact described in P exists. The self-referential character of this description only registers our recognitive judgment on its truth, in short, on its objectivity. The self-referential character of our speech act follows the same logic of recognition. We can and must therefore redescribe, for example, our promises in the same way if we wish to make explicit the dynamic of truth and objectivity which is inherent in them. I promise to come tomorrow means, in effect, it is as true that I will come tomorrow as I say so, and that by saying it, I judge that I had to come tomorrow. My utterance registers my recognition of the objective necessity of doing such an action, as well as the fact that I recognize having to do this action by means of my assertion of a true judgment that I operate here and now. My reflexive judgment and the agreement that I expect from my addressee express both a common desire to see me come tomorrow and the determining judgment of the affirmation that I express to confirm my coming tomorrow as a mutual and common happiness that will exist as based on this statement. This statement of truth expresses a common desire for truth about the action I designate by my words, and it simultaneously fulfills this desire for truth as a factual experience that I produce and that only my addressee is able to complete and fulfill by his or her agreement. The anticipation of this agreement expressed by the utterance in its use of the indicative mood, I promise to come tomorrow, as if the addressee's agreement was already arrived in my statement and was expressed in my performative utterance, constitutes and make an objective judgment that gives the addressee the opportunity to accept this fact, as well as to accept the expression of our common desire as being real, with giving the ability to accept as real the objective relationship that I anticipate between us as our reality in this dialogical relationship. All the speech act that will occur in this dialogue has this character of philosophical prosopopeia, bearing on the determination of the mutual and common happiness sought after, as well on the anticipated satisfaction of this desire itself. In this act of speech, and if these cancellations are made, the fact that I return tomorrow is affirmed and recognized philosophically as an aesthetic action by the sole fact that this affirmation operates in a self-referential way and let's consume today my coming tomorrow as a happiness. It must be added without being afraid to lose sight of the so-called pragmatic nature of speech act, but this cognitive and aesthetic characteristic determines the condition of possibility of any ethics inherent in the dialogical use of language. The reason is simple: this recognition, internal to each speech act, self-referentially denotes its own philosophical dimension by means of this double affirmation that we have made explicit and expressed as such. We must also admit that our addresses before have to judge the objective true value of the speech act as constitutive reharmonization of a common world with the world which they need, as well as they have to judge the objectivity of a mutual and common rejoicing in the face of this common happiness that is anticipated. Statements, comments, expression of feeling and belief have to be redescribed in similar way because they are all created by the speech act that we have to articulate to identifying the elements of the mental world and the social world that are there, as well as they are claimed to be as necessary for our life as they are actually as enjoyable for the social partner that we are. The dialogue of truth, which is applied to a so-called intraspecific drives and needs follows these laws, as well as the dialogue which must invent cultural force of life, presume independent of its drivers within our dialogical experience of the world, of others, and of ourselves. These objective laws of our dialogical second nature also governs each use of language and its articulation with the five senses. Because they are embedded in the articulation of five senses language, they are transcultural, although the cultural blisses that are searched and eventually produced dialogically in different languages can be expressed in different natural languages that seemingly seem to have nothing in common. Contrary to this deep dynamic of truth that animates our use of a dialogical imagination, the ethics and politics of consensus usually view the creative reharmonization of life as an arbitrary, spontaneous movement that must be controlled and justified by the very ethics and politics that would be presumed to have the force of law when they are enacted in the name of all members of an infinite communication community. That not only consists in giving the dialogue the constraining force of a training to impose on this irrational animal that we are then supposed to be, in order to get access to this presumed universal goal. But this access would in fact interrupt the dynamic of dialogue with oneself and with others that our human life effectively is. This political institutionalization of dialogue and its results could therefore only happen by neutralizing the need for dialogue and its dynamics of truth, which are necessary to live our lives. The use of language as prosopopeia does not only condition our capacity to live, it constrains also us, whether we like it or not, to project through it the best form of life. That is to say, access to mutual and common happiness as our common condition of life. This is also how it conditions the inner dialogue that we develop with ourselves when we think. Sharing this common judgment of truth about the objectivity of our common happiness is not an activity restrictive or reserved for the only speech act, but it is enough to say in order to do, but it characterizes also each speech act by which we identify the objectivity of the action we perform through our speech. The reason for this is very simple. In each speech act, we recognize in a way or another that we can only assume our existence by sharing it by means of our words, and that we identify it only as the only reality of speech act that allows it. The interlocutor tries to give each other their own living condition by means of this performing dialogue, which has to be both cognitive and gratifying. No institutional life insurance can guarantee their access and their success. Transposed in the thought, this dialogue effectively gives a law to the dialogical imagination. We cannot imagine the happy world in which we desire to live without to determine this world by anticipating the anticipated truth of this dialogue concerning it, as if it were already the most favorable one that we could wish for, just as we cannot anticipate the truth of its description without considering it as an objective truth of happiness. Because we transform our lives from dialogue by making our lives some dialogue, we project into all areas of human life the same desire for happiness that we feel when we create a consensus of truth about the happiness that we are looking for. This mutual and common happiness, which makes it possible to live together, cannot be reduced to a common good of communitarians, nor to the welfare of neoliberal moralists and economists. The recognition of the eudaimonic truth dynamics revolutionizes our understanding and use of dialogue. One is only able to recognize the occurrence of sharing truth by recognizing the objectivity of the mutual and common happiness, and we reharmonize the world that has been produced by this dialogue. The happiness of truth that accompanies the recognition becomes a common motivation when it is recognized as a cultural condition of life. when this sharing is as objective as true, that is to say, when its application in social and mental life has produced the expected happiness and the recognition of its social partners in it, we no longer have to consider it as a source of duty, but one must think of its application in life as an hypothesis and as an anticipation of an objectively desired happiness. And now we return to the artistic prosopopeias of happiness. How are we working? The contemporary discovery of the aesthetics of happiness in our use of language as a source of perception of the arts allows us to reinterpret aesthetic judgment. This can no longer be reduced to an effect of recognition of something beautiful which could be produced without the aid of a concept, as Kant and Heidegger thought it was. The artistic creation of the figures of happiness crowns the choice of our forms of life we produce when we project our argument of truth and the joy they give us in the best happiness of life in search of which we are. The aesthetic judgment that guides the creation of a work of art therefore follows the same dynamic as our use of language, and it obeys the same ideological law. It must identify the cultural blisses that occur in our social and mental worlds and try to give them an independent existence by exhibiting the best ways to live a human life by using our five senses. To figure these happinesses is to transform them into tangible reality, which can be recognized as objectively as one makes them effectively real. Their figuration allows us to experience that we are rejoicing in them by recognizing that this happiness constitutes our own truth because we manifest the ways of life that make us mutually happy. It is not only a question of giving an independent existence to the best life that we can live, but it also amounts to presuppose that these happinesses are already objectively recognized as such. That is to say that our culture are already capable of recognizing this life form as the best human form. If we always need an artistic experience, it is not because we die of the experience that we have of the truth, and for the sole reason that the experience of art will be the only one that could make us experience our humanity. But it is on the contrary because our aesthetic experience of truth remains inviolate in its creative capacity and always affirm its power to enlarge the domain of reality and gratification, opened by our experience of sharing the truth, that we recognize our capacity to rejoice in ourselves in the experiences where we live mutual and common happiness. Because the same dynamic of language is at work in the artistic use of material, for the simple reason that in this experience we use at least one of the five senses, which obeys the same audiophonic dynamic, which is also underlying such a short meaning. Because artistic creativity is driven by the inversion of the biological cycle of stimuli and reaction, Kant was right to consider this artistic creativity as a disinterested productivity which is directed toward the production of a self-referential finality, that is, toward the pure and simple possibility for him of enjoying the beauty of his product for himself. He nevertheless conceived of this joy felt with regard to a non-natural beauty by referring it to the model of the visual perception of a natural beauty, by a mute sense, the taste. Because this gratifying experience of beauty was reduced to the effect of reflection provoked by its mere physical reception. The judgment identifying as reflexive judgment, the joy felt with regard to a non-natural beauty, was reduced to an effect occurring as an event in our thinking, and was therefore devoid of cognitive significance. He thus truncated the experience of the work of art by separating the inseparable, the experience of its creation and the joy that emanated from the experience of life in which this work of art is part. Artistic taste appropriates itself to itself as a sort of metaphorical faculty of judging in common the reality of the beauty of a network, as magically as in Kant's eye, the perceptual experience extracted itself out of the chaotic and aggressive reception of multiple sensations. And this aesthetic prosopopoeia is oriented to present us the best life that we could dream, and that it is already present in the function of our imagination, its application, its art. But they figure this best life that we can imagine, and they put it as a reality, but they don't produce the happiness of life that we are figuring, and it must be very clear there. The art that comes closest to this goal is always the same, the one that asserts itself as the most attractive. It is unquestionably poetry. The poems speak to our thought as if they were presenting to us the most desirable desire as our reality, by presenting to us our own desire for existence, and by mimicking in this way the use of language which present to us the perception of words as a bliss for the simple reason that it cannot be to be false. But they themselves present this desire to us as the reality already so incandescent that it affirms itself in them. We cannot read them without rejoicing ourselves in them. Pure prosopopeias of themselves, they betray this essence in the escapable mysticism of Rainer Maria Rilke. To make us rejoice in this happiness, it must present itself as already being our reality, as well as the reality of the world that the poet makes speak. This means that he presents it as the reality that the poet and his readers expect to be, without having been able to rejoice in it before it can happen. The poet is therefore the one who makes his reader, as well as himself, desire that this most desired reality arrive as if he or she had created it. He or she makes his reader desire this as the author, as necessarily desired to be, it to exist, and to have been quite simply as able to think it. The experience of not being able to exist without being a completing it is giving us the feeling of the beauty of the poem. The poem thus assumes, so doing, the dynamic characteristic of thought itself, as a dynamic that does not tolerate the non-existence of what is thought about, at least during the time it has been produced or heard. It thus joins what novelists call the sound of the world, the unique experience in which all sounds rejoice in when they respect the set of interactions whose order affirms itself as the best real order of the world, produced by the respect that each author has of this mutual creation of all things by means of a magical poetic idealism. To attain this final goal, the poet must nevertheless dissociate himself or herself from this incandescent animism by recognizing that the desired reality, although it is desired as the best desired reality, does not exist, and that it has been produced to overcome the worst hiatus there is, it means his or her encounter with death. This kinetic force of poetics expresses itself in Pausel's brief crystals. These poetic crystals only affirm their own existence by situating it in the thinking breath of their poetic writing. But this affirmation does not exempt us from rejoicing in the value of objectivity, of the silent happiness that they make us breathe. That is to say, in the objective value of the dialogue by which the poet opens with his writing the access to itself as well as to his reader. For what? Because he thus opened access to the secret of any poem, while also saying that it does so. Because it is this breath that allows us to live and to rejoice in life, but this is only the crystallized breath of the poem, he can therefore afford to rejoice in the truth specific to the denunciation of the nonsense of the Holocaust, as well that which is specific to our affirmations of speaking, grief, and life. Like poetic writing, the composition of a painting transforms into independent reality the harmony that accompanies the creative use of speech and brings out visual perceptions. Because the use of the eyes mimics in their movements the internal harmony of the sounds emitted and heard, the word visualized simultaneously in return, seems itself to incorporate this harmony. This is evident when the child animates his vision as a dialogue with the world in order to be able to perceive it with his own eyes, but he thus physically enjoyed it his visualized world. But what distinguishes this animist experience of visual conception from the pictorial experience is that the latter precisely presents this harmony itself through the reality that is the painting, as if this reality embodied this harmony itself. As a pictorial prosopopeia, the painting aims to produce the same enjoyment of this reality, what we would feel if we were in the presence of the best visual experience of what has to be depicted. The creative enjoyment related to the writing of his painting tries to build and convey the joy compared to the experience of conveying the best vision of the world, revealed in the reality world that is the painting itself. Like poetic writing, pictorial composition starts from the gratification linked to the consciousness of reality and truth, in order to write by means of forms and colors the reality which we ourselves wish to enjoy, and it does so with a view to produce in us the consciousness of rejoicing in it. Mark Rothko was aware of this poetic ideal inherent in the pictorial creation. The painter tries to transfer the visual world of the visualized world of the face made present by painting into a happiness in itself. He or she first reconstruct the original experience of the prosopopeia by the infant, where the propositional enunciation, thought or spoken by him, lend to visual perception the gratifying power of the sounds heard, and thus gave it the impression that the word spoke to it, lending visual reality the gratification felt by the ear itself. The isolation of the visualized perception by the painter presents to us, that the painter presents to us, tries to obtain for our eyes the enjoyment of the best work to which it effectively gives existence. The pictorial prosopopeia also lends to painting the gratifying experience that thought makes of itself when it emancipated itself from perception. Any painting that is perceived as beautiful makes these phenomena exist, which phenomenologists call the epoche of itself. And because it is the presence of our judgment about the best space that is presented as having to be seen. And this harmonization that is paradigmatically shown in poetry animates also the sculptures. As Adolf Hildebrand has pointed out, the sculpture also needs to perceive the dialogical participation of his own body in his environment in order to be able to visually objectify the plastic form of the sculpture. Because the harmony felt by the sculptor with his own body is what he or she visually or dialogically projects into the sculpted body. He or she makes his or her own harmony, speaking the sculpted body, which thus becomes a prosopopeia of his own body. This communicational projection of one's own body into the visualization of the world being sculpted is something that must be dialogical, affirmed by the sculptor himself, in order to be seen as an objective harmony inherent in the sculpted body. As the child's Babel projected the harmony between his sounds and his sounds heard into the visual world, so as to be able to allow this world to be the source of this harmony perceived by him between the sound and to ratify his own ears. The perception of sculpted body is only so gratifying and has a beauty in itself because this once incorporated into reality the a priori harmony that we ourselves enjoy in our relationships with our own bodies and with the bodies of our partner. It's often an objective space that is oriented with the projection of action and of the seeing. But these bodies must reinvest their space in order to be provided with a prosopopeia that manages them to make this space speak. The word law only effective laws is a material abstractions and reaches its destination if it's seen and animated by different characters who present themselves as the explicit prosopopeia of themselves and of ourselves, and allow us to judge the objectivity of the dialogue they lead on themselves. Theatrical sense brings its spectator into the secret mysteries of common human happiness and misfortune by limiting their own animation of their mental life simply because they allow time to be perpetually reborn within it. The theatrical prosopopeia makes human life itself speak the way we make the prosopopeia speak in our own life, the reason being that our own life is itself only a prosopopeia dialogue. The theatre indeed mimics the enjoyment of the form when this one considers the perpetual rebirth of itself as a dialogue with the world, with others, and with oneself. It therefore presents the objective happiness of humanity, presented that it cannot realize the only a philosophy as aesthetics that tries to put the vision of this best world of action and judge the objective happiness that is produced in it can do this. But the theater does not do this. Also, we use this dialogical imagination that is produced, that produce our mental life. And after we must see that this the limits of theater are there, but they try to be overcome by the cinematographic hypothesis as a kind of film that let us see our life as if we have to see it before our dying. It means before the end of the cinematographic prosopopée. Music and dance is the most important for a kind of aesthetics to really incorporate the joys that motivates, accompanies and prompts the happiness that mentalize, make us feel as a river of a dialogue of thought with itself. Because the time, we don't think about, usually about it, but the time is coming as a pleasure in us, and it is this movement that the theater and cinema exteriorized in order to let us part to the happiness that we show. But how music is using this reborning of time in us in order to let hear the happiness that we are. And dance moves, is the art we are letting feeling the real independence of our members by the possibility of enjoying the dance by dancing or by seeing dancing as the way that aesthetics must do. It means to free us of the necessity of subordinate our thought and our imagination to any institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jacques Poulain. It was a fascinating talk. I was told from the studio, I got some updates. I was told that we continue with the second speech by Tania Rivera, and the discussion is postponed to the end of this session. Okay, so let me introduce our second speaker today. Tania Rivera is psychoanalyst and essayist. She's working in a multidisciplinary field of critical reflection regarding the intertwining between subject and culture, moving from between psychoanalysis, philosophy, artistic and literary theory, as well as practice. She is a full professor at the Department of Art at the Universidade Federal Fluminense. She was working as a visiting professor in the Department of Plastic Arts at the Université Paris VIII in 2016. She's author of several books. I will just mention the book from 2013, which is the reverse of imaginary contemporary art and psychoanalysis, which was a Jabuti Prize in the category of psychology and psychoanalysis next year. She is also a curator, art curator of exhibitions, Places of Delirium, for example, among others, and her today's talk is entitled Parody, Mockery, and Delirium.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like first to thank, of course, the staff of this beautiful event for this invitation. And I have to say that it is a real pleasure to me to be with you with you all, and especially to share this table with my colleagues here. Well, I would like to start showing a picture. Let's stay with this image for a while. Yes, this one. It is the picture of Arthur Bispo do Rosario's studio, showing himself amidst his works. What a mess. So let's launch to Bispo's world, and maybe we will have to fasten our seatbelts. I don't know, let's see. I think recent art tries to put into action discursive strategies that dialogue with hegemonic narratives in culture in order to transform them, even if minimally. The tactics used are diverse and seem to escape every attempt of classification. I would rather try to enter this complex field in a transversal way, one of the relations between art and madness, by examining the work of Arthur Bispo do Rosário first, in order to attempt to highlight his strategies of subverting the very logic of representation. If I have the time, I will also comment briefly on a very important recent work entitled Literal Ballet by one of the most important living Brazilian artists, Laura Lima, which also accomplishes a sort of dismantling of the structure of representation itself. Reflecting on these strategies, I resorted to the notion of delirium as a kind of clinical theoretical operator. I think it is an interesting term to denote human pathos. As in Portuguese, at least, it signifies not only a symptom accompanied by great suffering, but also the possibility of a joyful surpassing of social limits in extraordinary situations as carnival, for example. So it maybe has to do with happiness somehow. What a pity that, you are here. So, I will try to talk about happiness a little bit, let's see. As indicated by the etymology of this term, delirium, which denotes the ridge that is pushed up out of the closed furrow, it has to do with the deviant potentials of subjectivization. Moreover, delirium points out the possibility of constructing deviant realities in order to denunciate the arbitrariness of common reality itself, the reality we usually adhere to as a perceptual and cognitive evidence. Delirium shows its narrative structure as a matter of power and submission to patterns of perception. The delirious power of deviating from the lines of such weft of rails implies, therefore, a vigorous micropolitical affirmation of singularity. Please, Anna, could you pass slide 3 to 10 slowly or well, in your rhythm. And then when you arrive at 10, you stop, please. So this can be seen in Bispo's oeuvre as in a very clear way. Bispo is certainly known by most of you as he has a great international recognition since the 1990s. His figure of a black, old, crazy man that had lived most of his lifetime in an asylum in subhuman conditions has been widely shown in the media. This romantic image of the crazy artist is touching and heroic. It presents the man as someone who lived in great isolation and succeeded in overtaking his suffering by constructing a great work of art. And that's undoubtedly true, and also important to the psychiatric reform that was beginning to change public opinion about madness and about the isolation of so-called mad people in institutions in Brazil and in the rest of the world. Bispo has been, in that moment, a kind of iconic and sublime proof of the very humanity and even of the great cultural value of people in severe mental suffering. Thereby, he seems to perform the traditional role due to psychiatric patients since the 1920s to prove the legitimacy of modernist anti-naturalist proposals. Alongside with children and the so-called primitives, the insane artists have been then called to sustain a sort of anthropological truth. But the argument was based on the naturalization of their segregation in institutions. That is a matter of biopolitics, as Michael Foucault would state. So it was naturalized, this segregation, as if it was a total withdrawal of reality. The astonishing artistic production, which began to interest modernist artists in the second decade of the 20th century for being surprisingly close to the expressionist experiments, confirmed the latter's authenticity as art, rather than some mere passing fad. It is in this context that artist Paul Klee, in 1912, for example, when commenting on the first exhibition of the group Der Blaue Reiter in Munich, spoke of, I will quote Klee, original artistic germs that could be found in the ethnographic museums or in children's bedrooms, mentioning the works of the insane as parallel phenomena and observing that, I quote Klee, the level of insane is not, therefore, in any way an offensive term, end of quotation. Klee also stated that this production could, I quote him, be taken more seriously than all the fine art museums, inasmuch as it's time to reform today's art. So, the very gesture of valuing the production of the so-called insane people thus carries the paradox of reinforcing the segregation from so-called normal people and normal artists, as they autism, a term invented in 1907 by Eugen Bleuler to name the withdrawal from reality, is supposed to remove them out of culture itself. In this path, Jean Dubuffet would propose in 1945 to call art brut, or something like raw art, this kind of production that would be a part of what he calls cultural arts. We could think Bispo stands in the same position as those patient artists of the first half of the century, but this is a false impression, in my point of view. Because Bispo shows another paradigm, a new one, the one of a radical relationship between art, life, society and politics, that not only shares technical characteristics with contemporary artists, but also makes explicit something that is not yet entirely clear in contemporary art studies in general. The act of supporting an ethical proposition in the culture with oneself own life and body as a very important condition to art in our times. I think this ethical attitude is modulated by strategies like delirium, and especially its modulation in mimicry or mockery. I'm not sure about what term would be the best to traduce the Portuguese word arremedo. that is a very resembling, mimetic way of imitate something or someone, but it produces not a perfect copy, but something a little bit different. And it can be also, it can have also a humor and even a sarcastic aim, as we will see in a moment. I would like to ask you to help me to think about those terms and maybe bring other ones to our discussion. But first, I have to state that talking about that as strategies, a term also used by Sukarovic yesterday, doesn't mean, however, that delirium may be seen as a kind of intentional instrument by Bispo, in an idealization or a disregard of the severe suffering of most people that are led to the construction of non-hegemonic realities. It is also very important to highlight the fact that social and racial exclusion, as well as gender violence, are crucial factors in affective breakdowns, especially in a country such as Brazil, which is extremely marked by colonial violence and slavery. We can even affirm that Bispo is known as a psychiatric patient artist, and not only as a great Brazilian artist as Elliot Sica, Ligia Clark, and some others, above all because of his racial and economic situation, responsible, at least in part, for the length of his hospitalization. Instead of taking delirium as a symptom or a fake way of perceiving and thinking that should be removed by medication, I would like to highlight delirium as a kind of clinical and political performance at the same time. It comes from the violent rocking of everyday life that Sigmund Freud calls fantasy of the end of the world. This fantasy consists on a radical removal of libido from the others, due to a situation of intense suffering that corresponds to a fragmentation of the self, which is hence shredded into pieces, as the word schizophrenia underlines. In a second moment, an attempt to mend that tear in the fabric of reality takes place, engaging in a true reweaving of the world, which we can identify as the very work of delirium. It's time to repopulate the world, what means to rebuild it in every detail, as Bispo shows, putting in movement things and words, and putting libido back to it in order to forge a place to oneself. As Freud pointed out, this long and toilful work is an attempt at a cure that can eventually lead to a clinical stabilization. Before exploring the strategies delirium seems to incite, I should present briefly Bispo's oeuvre, or rather, what I will call Bispo's situation. His extraordinary mixture of art and life as a radical subversion of space and object hegemonic logics, as well as of representation itself, in order to point out other logics or strategies. Arthur Bispo do Rosário was born in 1909 or 11, there are doubts about that, and died in 1909. His work beckons for an ethical gaze over and above any aesthetic appreciation. The recognition of his work has a clear political reach, and moreover constitutes an inaugural milestone of the anti-asylum struggle in Brazil. To denounce the subhuman conditions of the patients in the asylums, Samuel Weiner Filho, a journalist, filmed the hospital, Colônia Juliano Moreira, for a television program in 1880. Upon watching it, art critic Frederico Moraes has his first contact with, I quote Moraes, the figure of a black man worn by age and illness, alone amidst a vast hodgepodge of objects, embroidering words, names, dates, images, end of quotation. He recognized it as art, that hodgepodge, which echoes international experiments from the 1960s onward. The use of banal and poor elements and the objects of daily life, similar to what was done by artists of the Fluxus or Arte Povera movements, for example, as well as his capes and banners that resonate Hélio-Oiticica's Parambolés. Bispo was born in the state of Sergipe, in Brazil's northeast, and most likely entered the Naval Cadet School at the age of 15. It is well known that the sailors, mostly black, were treated violently in the Navy, thus leading to the Revolta da Chibata, Revolt of the Whip, in 1910, an uprising against the physical punishment and bad living conditions on board the ships. The insurrection put down by the authorities in a bloody way could hardly have resulted in significant changes in the sailors' situations in the 20s and 30s. It is known that Bispo was a Sinoman and received many punishments for bad behavior until being discharged in 1933. During the period that he served in Rio de Janeiro, since 26, he had developed a parallel career as a boxer, as attested by reports in newspapers that praised the bravery and toughness of the lightweight they nicknamed Bronze Seaman. When he left the Navy, he got a job with a transport company, at which three years later, he suffered an accident that severely injured one of his legs, ending his boxing career. In 1937, he was fired for refusing to follow orders and hired lawyer José Maria Leone to defend him in a workers' rights suit. He then became a sort of living household worker for the Leone family in a conventional employment relationship that perpetuates slavery in an euphemistic way in Brazil. Please, next slide. And the next one. Around Christmas in 1938, he had a psychotic breakdown that is embroidered on some of his pieces, mainly on the banner known for bearing the inscription "Eu preciso dessas palavras", escrita. I need these words written, this banner. He tells that 7 angels appeared to him and demonstrated that he should present himself at the church. He walked toward the city's downtown and, in his words, wound up being sent by the friars, I'm quoting Bispo, who recognized me. I said that I had come to judge the living and the dead. They perceived and ordered me to come to the asylum. End of quotation. Living as a patient first at the Hospital Nacional de Alienados under the diagnosis of schizophrenia, he went to different psychiatric institutions in the city for many years. It seems established that he escaped from Colônia Juliano Moreira in 1954, returning to it definitively 10 years later, according to detailed research by Flávio Coppas. Arthur Bispo do Rosário's adventures in life presents mysteries still to be revealed, like the hypothesis that he spent time as a wildcat cat gold miner in the 50s. Whatever he was, it is difficult to summarize it in the figure of the mentally insane genius who spent 50 years in isolation. Between 1964 and 1980, when he lived at the Colonia and sometimes spent days in total voluntary isolation combined with fasting, Bispo used to read newspapers and kept abreast of what was happening worldwide, as attested by some mentions of countries in his work. He commented, for example, on the Russian invasion of Afghanistan when questioned by Weiner Filho. Another facet to emphasize is the artist's ability to be with other people in his own way and to make himself respect by them, as shown by reports of the Leone family and of colleagues and professionals at the Colonia, who tell how he would sometimes use his strength to help control patients. This strategy may have helped Bispo to garner the sympathy of the institution's team and get them to collaborate towards obtaining the material necessary to produce his work, like uniforms that he would unravel to obtain the blue thread with which he made these embroideries, along with needles, fabrics, plastic mugs, shoes, etc., plus magazines for reading, according to Marta Dantas. Moreover, his own work, or his miniatures, as he called them, despite having been made completely apart from any occupational therapy or art workshop, kindled admiration and respect inside the institution, allowing him to obtain a great physical space and total control concerning who could enter there. More than being surprised by the production of an extraordinary work of art, despite the utterly adverse conditions of life of this black, poor, mentally insane man, it seems that we should take his production as something that encompasses all of this in a sort of Bispo's situation. We can consider the anti-asylum political context as a part of it, as are the circumstances of Bispo's discovery by Frederico Moraes. In this situation, the micropolitical dimension of his activity can be seen as a sort of radical embodiment of not only the blend between art and life desired by modern art, but also of an ethical dimension of intervention in culture. This ethical dimension was pointed out by Brazilian critic Mário Pedrosa in his definition of postmodern art, talking about the artist Eliot Sica, in a 1967 text that states a definition of this notion of postmodern art before the famous proposal of Leo Steinberg about it as the abandonment of verticality in favor of the flatbed in 1968, 1 year after Mário Pedrosa. For Pedrosa, this art brought down, I quote Pedrosa, all the modalities of expression, painting, picture, sculpture, etc., in favor of a proposed total, integral manifestation of the artist in his or her creations. End of quotation. Resonating what Sica proposed to call environmental art, Pedrosa talks about an art in situation in which, I quote him, nothing is isolated. There is no artwork that can be appreciated in itself like a picture. Please, Anna, slides the 13 and 14. As we can see in those slides, and also coming back, yes, one of them was our first slide, we have seen it already. Both of them show the elements of Bispo's work life as a mass of pieces that are displayed in a very curious way in his studio. This area of the hospital with 10 cells that have been assigned to him in the last years of his life. There is no apparent logic in this topsy-turvy, and it could hardly be considered as an installation or something like Kurt Schwitter's Mass Ball, as the elements are in constant motion in the space and between themselves. Besides, it is sometimes impossible even to define if something could be considered an artwork or a set of materials or practice devices necessary for making works. Let's see the next slide, please. And then 16 and 17 too, please. The cards shown in those slides, for example, should them be taken as cards of material or artworks? And then slides 18 and 19. The iron sheet we are seeing now, what is a practical device? Was it a practical device to filter daylight coming from the windows or an artwork? The indecision, the possibility of being something that is at the same time inside and outside art can be seen as a real prowess, I guess, in the context of contemporary art's intention to be outside the world of art, as has also been commented by Sukarovic yesterday. Through his strategy, the invisible but fundamental operation of delimiting something as art from the rest of the world is refused and may be overcome by Bispo. Besides that, in his studio, those pieces were regularly displaced, constantly reviewed, and even mixed together. None of them has a title or date, and the titles that I reproduce in some of these slides have been chosen by Federico Moraes. So, those characteristics oblige us to face the very question of what is an object or a work of art in general, and which are its relations to the world. Is it a representation of something in a mimetic way? Or would it be a kind of device to put reality into question as a kind of internal and subtle bomb that would resemble reality in order to defeat it better? I think the first crucial operation here is the subversion of the ordering principle of the neutral surface. I mean, the wall or base on which each thing is traditionally inscribed as an object of or work of art. Thus, Bispo makes us pass from representation to dispersion, spreading elements in the space in a topological way, as a kaleidoscope, maybe, that could be taken as an intent to put institutional space inside out, and thus virtually knock down the very walls of the colony. Walls that have also been included in this moving mass, indeed, as they received also some drawings that have been discovered some years ago. Let's see the next slide, please. I think yes. This one shows a small part of the walls that have been not painted, but have received drawings from Bispo. And this shows us, by ricochet, how establishing a neutral surface as a base of representation is always an act of power. Next slide, please. Yes. In this slide, we can see an attempt to display an exhibition following this dispersive logic of Bispo's work. My attempt to do that in the exhibit Lugares do Delírio, Places of Delirium, curated by me in two versions, in Museu de Arte do Rio, MA, in 2017, and in Sesc Pompeia, in São Paulo, in 2018. There were no panels or pedestals, but simple tables of different heights, on which a work is almost never alone. Next slide, please, Nana. As you can see, the attempt was obviously defeated. It would be impossible to display such works of art constantly in the institutional space, of course. Even so, I like to think things were somehow in motion there. What's true about people passing through the space between the tables, at least. Until now, I've been trying to emphasize how Bispo's work surpasses the very logic of identity that distinguish each art object from another object of art, as well as from other objects of the world, and also from the space around it. Now, let's examine how Bispo's things refer to things in the world. Next slide, please. Yes. Thus, for example, Bispo's bow and arrow is the object that it is, but it is also is also revealed as one object among others wrapped with blue thread. The gesture of the hand, destroying uniforms, takes precedence over the representation in regard to how the thread is wrapped, for example, as well in the small irregularities of the embroidered letters that name the object that, instead of reinforcing its meaning, curiously displays and suspends it, putting in question also the relation between language and objects. From mimetic representation, it is displaced in front of our eyes to transmit of a sort of presence, a unique poetic and political presence of the artist who made it. In this direction, we can say that the representation of something is turned into a presentation of oneself, or that both stand in the same gesture, in a kind of representation with parentheses separating the first syllable. There is no representation without the presentation of his agent, as stated by Bispo's works, forging a place for oneself in a world, a reality in which one had no place before that. Moreover, this never-ending task of repopulating the world also strangely denounces, in a sort of ricochet, the precarious and relative character of reality itself. Despite being figurative, the basic operation of Bispo's work would be the submission, couldn't be the submission to the appearance of things, nor to hegemonic discourse that sustains it. His logic is rather that of mimicry or mockery, or arremedo in Portuguese. This figure of speech indicated a rather faithful imitation of the original, but which ironically twists it in a given situation. As a student, for example, does when repeating a phrase spoken by his teacher in the exact same way, imitating his voice. It is almost identical, but by some inaccuracy, as well as by the whole situation in which it is performed, it implies rebellion and the subversion of the hegemonic logic in its power structure. Let's see the next slide, please. Parallelepiped. the thing itself, the paving stone, is appropriated as a kind of ready-made. But the little car in which it is placed, that has another scale, displaces it from common reality in order to open it to a kind of magical or poetic world. In addition of that, the word parallelepiped is written down on one of the sides of the car in order to displace language itself, to put it in motion too, in a singular personal way that could be seen as a simple matter of error eventually, as Bispo was a nearly illiterate man, but seems to me much more a matter of dealing with language with one's own hands, let's say. This is a good example of how to manipulate things and words in order to invent another reality and to transmit, to communicate it to us, to the others, accomplishing a great micropolitical aim, that is very difficult to accomplish, to make singularity the very material of social bond. I think this has maybe to do with the happiness of sharing the truth you was talking about, Jacques. But I am proposing here that truth could be delusional, of course. As I have some minutes left, I will quickly comment Laura Lima's literal ballet. So we will pass to slides, yes. And then please, Anna, you can pass to 28 while I'm speaking, okay? The gesture that defines this work, the basis of her choreography, let's say, is defenestration. Highly varied objects that call into question the notion of a work of art, if not more radically still, the very idea of the object. So varied objects are sent through the window of the gallery, a Gentil Carioca, in Rio de Janeiro, at regular intervals, suspended by a steel wire that crosses the street, or rather a small crossroad, until they disappear into one of the balconies of the townhouse in front, which also belongs to the gallery. The movement is continuous, but pulses to the rhythm of the pedaling of two people, one in each building, on the bicycles that serve as an engine for the ingenious pulley wire slide system, which uses no electricity. It also pulses through the rhythm of the music that accompanies it, as is inevitable with a ballet, performed by two groups positioned on two of the corners. The structure that supports everything is both fragile and solid, with its iron posts and steel wire rotating around the circuit, somewhat loosely. As on an immaterial dissection table, the guts of the gallery, the gears of the art circuit, and the very substance of the world and art are extracted, and its heterogeneous elements refract through the world, like a cubist painting opening out into space. As a quick remark, we shall know that Laura Lima, who had never had a psychiatric diagnosis herself, says she decided to be an artist in her adolescence, precisely at the moment her brother had a psychotic breakdown. Let's see, next slide, please, and until 32, please, you can pass them. Returning to Lima's hodgepodge spread at the streets, We can pass over the crossroads and into the gallery buildings to see the objects being launched into the air, floating for a while on the street in the city, and then being collected and arranged in the exhibition room. They move from the hands that hang them on the wire to the hands that take them off and put them on the ground. And we feel that here they can likewise be hung and transformed into words and images, offering themselves up to the gaze of others. On reaching the midpoint of the aerial journey, each element uniquely attracts the gaze on being illuminated by a flash of light. A few meters ahead of the horizon, attached to the steel wire, some rows of plastic chairs that were not initially foreseen are arranged. Sitting in one of them, it seems that I'm watching a strange spectacle. But suddenly, everything turns, and I realize that the literal ballet defenestrated its own window, fenestra. And when the scene reveals and highlights its own structure, no further spectacle is possible. The stage is dismantled, the way sprayed. Things get mixed up with the world. Let's go on until 39 very quickly because I have some minutes and then it will be over. As if an invisible propeller began to violently turn at 45 degrees and thus responded to the wild wind that has shaken the country since the coup of 2016, the coup d'etat. The classifications and places of objects and words, images and people are crushed. A beekeeping suit that resembles a space suit descends. The slogans are here. Free Lula, trust is a balaclava, for instance. Two soup bowls joined at the edges oscillate as they hang from a chain, pretending to be a flying saucer. Various visual poems are read, printed on banners or sheets, which mix lyricism and denunciation. Real fish levitate wearing curious adornments. The music continues in the regular rhythm. The copy of A Still Life passes and the triangular space cut into its center reveals the window of one of the mansions of the street. Frenetic legs turn the pedals. Fine fabric releases dry ice from its folds. A glamorous chandelier is filled with chicken drumsticks, coxinhas in Portuguese, instead of candles. Someone is surprised and outraged to see a donkey hanging from the wire as if dead. A copy of a painting by Bosch shows strange medieval figures. A police dog escapes my notice and provides a counterpoint to the agitated tone of the room that absorbs whatever crosses the crossroads, etc., etc., etc. And who knows, after about 3 hours of this wondrous anti-spectacle, this delirious ritual, this live Dadaist collage that carries us away in its continuous motorcycle movement and expands there, inside and outside of us, if we will be able to dismantle the power structure that violently sustains our faltering reality, to denude and ultimately kill the king, or rather to defenestrate the abominable tyranny. And then the 3 last slides, please. This tyranny was our ex-president, of course. Rather than just talking about the literal ballet, taking it as a thought object, it is necessary to recognize it literally as thought, not as an object that we can think of, but as thought itself, as the concrete modulation of such in objects, images, words, and deeds. It is an active reflection to be realized in the world, manipulating the hegemonic lines of force to propose other drawings, other lines, explosions, checkmate. There is no image, no more representation. When everything is literal, the scene shows its own guts, and the ballet becomes a kind of striptease. It strips reality itself. Hierarchies are broken, the elements of life are disqualified. Image, word, animal, thing, banner, people. Everything is equivalent and mixed together in horizontality. Life, or rather history, undone and redone without stopping, like in a constantly moving puzzle. The ballet is a disassembly device for the delusional, the mad, and who knows, revolutionary, maybe, reordering of the world. By showing things literally, this work tried to dismantle the literality of hegemonic discourse. Lima says the literal use of language is fascist. The literal use of language is fascist, as we can see especially today, and that to combat this powerful literality, according to the Pharmacon principle, one has to be literal. To make it explicit, to repeat literally this device, and thus dismantle it. After all, as Gilles Deleuze said, I quote, "If you speak and show, you will speak and show literally, or you will simply not show. Either it will be literal, or it will be nothing." End of quotation. But the ballet makes such literality spin like in a pirouette. There is a diversion, an ornament, a suspension. There is humor and some kind of mimicry or mockery. And above all, there is someone there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tania. Thank you for this applause, well deserved. Now we have time for this very important part of this keynote lectures, which is question and answer part. There's one specific favor I have to ask you, since there's ongoing online streaming of these lectures, I kindly ask you to come to the front of the table and use this beautiful microphone over there. So you will be seen and heard, everywhere. So who's gonna be the first one? Yes, please. So this, yeah. Probably yes.
Mike, thank you for your wonderful explanations, and I would like to ask both of you. It's a simple question, I think. Oh.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I want to ask you both a simple question. That is happiness a search for order or harmony?
I should say, it's a search, art is a search for harmony, but it affirms itself in the substantialization, hypostasia of this harmony, and it can surely turn against itself as an autoimmune research. It can fall back into a kind of experimental deconstruction of this imagination, like we can be intelligence destined, like shining sign, but we can be today a kind of the artist who seeks to confront himself with himself by this pure experimental use of art in order to get all the happiness that he could attain, but without reflecting about it. It's possible. It's our everyday experimentation of deconstruction of our art in some work of art. It's not. It can be, and it is be when the world, where the people, the artists, are confronting with ourselves in a kind of desperation about the world. It's a kind of, and they can find themselves and be really artists when they affirms that art as art that could be seen or to be felt as an encounter of the adversary, of his viewer, of his hearer with themselves.
Thank you for this simple, I don't know if it was really simple, but very important question. I think that as the delirium shows, harmony can be somehow reached by disorder. And I think contemporary art has to do with that too, or part of the production in contemporary art. To make it short, I would say that I think there are probably many kinds of order logics, and art is maybe the field in culture in which some other orders can be put in action and address it to people, and sometimes it reaches a real transmission, and then it can maybe become a new order. So I think plurality is very important to think about this question.
Monsieur Poulain, life means referring to the richness of our senses, all of our senses, not only seeing, hearing, but also smelling, tasting, touching. Since you come from France, I assume that you will agree with me when I say Marcel Proust has given us a wonderful example for an explanation of such a sensational theory. À la recherche du temps perdu is a novel about the search of happiness, and it is a novel about the thesis that we find that happiness only via our memory. We find it when we reconsider our past. Thus, it's a melancholic happiness we get. But for you, Monsieur Poulain, I guess it has a double consequence. The first one is, if you really want to connect aesthetics with a speech act theory, you must extend speech act theory into a speech act theory of metaphors. Since à la recherche du temps perdu is a huge example for the productivity of metaphors. Is aesthetics of happiness. It can only be an aesthetics of metaphorical happiness. Would you agree?
Thank you for these questions. Because effectively, you are right to say that with Proust, we have the paradigmatic way of presenting confrontation of oneself to the memory, to the past, and to try to find oneself. But for the first questions, it does not make of the work of Proust a physical aesthetics. It means it is like every art, a categorical proposal of one's life as a source of recognition for oneself and from the others. And the philosophical aesthetic, by contrast, judge whether this interest and happiness that is coming in the thought of Proust is transmittable to everybody in order that one can find oneself, confront with oneself, with a self, with a self radical and objective happiness, because it is this moment of philosophical aesthetics that gives his judgment about the reality of the happiness that is felt by Proust himself in his report, or if it is a kind of a psychical way of avoiding one's life. And it is on this point that cannot be metaphorical. It is a transmission. Le temps perdu is a transmission of its confrontation of Proust towards itself, but can it be transmitted as a form of life in which the other could recognize itself? And it is this philosophical question that eliminates this reduction of art to its psychological elements, to the reduction to psychiatric symptoms, because it is there that the philosophical aesthetic can do what it has to do. It means project experiences that allow everybody to be able to forget every constraint and every obsession of training, of civilization training, and this, the metaphor is only, the expression of the metaphor is only the way in which we recognize that we transfer a concept from one domain to another, and that if Proust transfers us from the domain of psychology to our essence, it does not give us the secret of art, it means, but the philosophical aesthetic it means reconstruct this horizon of language in which we judge our own reality. And it can be used as a way of escaping to the reality of ik and me, and to be judged as this. The companion could judge this report of life, but it does not allow philosophical aesthetic to be only a report of this transfer of oneself in the pure will to recognize itself in the past.
Sit down. I have a few questions for Tania. Found your talk very interesting. First one is this idea of the mad artist is a cliche, romantic cliche that can be traced back to the Renaissance. We have to admit that we're fascinated with the mad artist because we imagine that this artwork hides some secret meaning that we cannot understand because the artist is supposed to be mad. So this meaning lies on the other side of the frontier of sanity and insanity. So we become some kind of mental tourist taking a tour around insanity, and we're fascinated. So first question, are we interested in the art itself, or are we interested because the artist is supposed to be mad? Which I think is a bit the second one. That's the first question. Second one, I'm a note here. It's already difficult to criticize artists who are more or less sane. It's already difficult, I know that. So how can we criticize the work of a mad artist using the same tools? Maybe we would have to find a critic that is also mad to try to understand the work of the mad artist. Usually the critics are not mad, sometimes they're extravagant or weird, but they're usually quite rational. So that's the second question. And so the last one there would be, we have to admit that not all mad artists are good artists. I don't think so. So how can we distinguish the good artwork from the bad artwork from the mad artist? I think that's the most tricky one.
Thank you for your questions. There are very important questions and very difficult ones because we tend to think about madness as a condition, as a, let's say, a real and undoubtable condition, as if it was a condition, I don't know, like pneumonia. And it's not the case. Mental illness, as shown by Michel Foucault, mainly, is a very complex social construction. So we don't have causes and symptoms very clear and in direct relation as we used to have in organic conditions. So mental conditions are, even if we have now some syndromes and classification, huge work of classification of symptoms in syndromes, etc., mainly by DSM in United States. We have a set of symptoms, but it doesn't mean it is a condition as, I don't know, as COVID. So we are talking about something that has to do with humanity and in his I can't say essence, but in his strong problematic nature. So Bispo, I was trying to talk about Bispo, examine his work, taking for sure this critical position about madness and mental conditions. So I think we have to put as psychiatric reform status now for some decades, that we have always to put it in suspension, this kind of diagnosis, even if, of course, we know that some people have very important and severe symptoms that can make life very hard. So the idea of a secret meaning transmitted by the artworks of mad people is very beautiful in my point of view, but I would I would question if we can consider that it is always the case about normal artists too. I mean, this secret meaning doesn't come from the madness, this madness supposed in someone, but in a kind of very complex relation between things and meanings that art displays and develops and explores, in my point of view. So I agree with you in the idea that culturally, we could try to historicize it, but it would be very long. So in the 20th century, we have this very clear construction of a kind of romantic figure of mad artist, of the mad artist. But I don't think it is different about the tools to criticize it. I think we have the same problem here that we have in art in general. Which tools do we have to criticize art? That's always a problem. I mean, that's what makes critics interesting, because it isn't this direct and mechanic, isn't it? So the thing is, there is a kind of idealization of mad artist production in 20th century, and I think Bispo breaks with this stereotype stereotyped. So with him, we can think about art itself, trying to get out of this idealization that is paradoxically segregating, very in a very complex and serious way, in my point of view. So with Bispo, what I was trying to do is to mix together this delimitations, and that's what I tried to do in this exhibition, Places of Delirium too. We had artists like Bispo identified with the psychiatric world, let's say, with many others like Silvio Meirelles or Ana Maria Maiolino or many others, Laura Lima also, that have nothing to do with this universe, this delimitation, in order to put them together and to see what one work says to another work, or what problems and questions they make emerge in this kind of relationship between themselves. I'm talking about the works themselves, questioning each other and showing us how conventional this kind of delimitation is.
Thank you. I just want to say that we are already a bit late for our cultural presentation. I'm sorry to rush. I know it's been a very brief discussion. I hear Fiona has a super quick, very, very quick question. Is that it? Should anyone quicker answers? That's perfect.
Okay, so I have two questions, one for each of you, and I'm going to start with Tania. And it seems to me that you're suggesting that there is, with Bispo, at the very least, a problematization of intentionality. And I'm wondering whether that has to be a rejection of intentionality, or it could be rather a complication.
Intentionality operating at various different levels. Like in the phenomenal world, you can see the idea of reverse intentionality, which is not in any way exterior to the act itself. And my question to Jacques is, and this may be a little bit ungenerous, but it is, if there is an a priori of happiness, why are we so good at destroying it? And so why are we so good at destroying happiness? And isn't it rather, although I hope, because there is a principle of hope, that we are also good and we are at least looking for happiness, isn't it rather a dialectic between the possibility of happiness and our great talent for destroying happiness?
So thank you for your very interesting question. I have to respond to it in 2 words. So that's a big problem, but also very simple in some way, because I don't think we are entirely in the field of intentionality, never in our life. As a psychoanalyst, I believe, and I think I have proofs in my experience that even something intentionally conceived, and let's say in the traditional way, like something one has first planned to do and then began to construct the conditions for it, etc., is in the middle of this path, changed by many factors. As Marcel Duchamp states, the artistic quotient would be in this deviation of the intention, much more than in intention itself. So I think, well, we could, of course, we should talk about it in a very serious way regarding Bispo's condition, of course, because he was in delirium, of course, but it was a very intentional delirium. He knew very precisely what he was doing. So it's also part of this idealization of mad artists in the kind of model of the trance how can I say that in English? Someone that, like, receiving spirit is capable to do something that he wouldn't be able to do in himself. That's an idealization that Jean Dubuffet constructs and is responsible for, I think. And it's false. I think it's just false. It isn't like that. Things isn't like that. If we see someone, a mad artist, working, it has nothing to do with that. It isn't like a spiritual trance. So it's intentional, but it shows maybe other types of intention, or it puts intention in question, in crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Sure, there is a kind of competence to realize the way one is meeting the other and oneself, and to show this meeting as a real and irreal harmony. But to take a simple example, a poesy which is following itself in the thought of the poet, can intend to put to existence this happiness that he feels when he tries and succeeds to meet himself to the other. And in this way, we recognize the same philosophical intentionality that I try to explain in the speech act. Because there we have a kind of everyday philosophical reflection that brings to existence the possibility of transmitting oneself to the other. And as an example, I could say that the 5th August in Belo Horizonte, there will be a presentation of internal philosophical poetry, an example of Brazilian and philosopher poet, but will present Amara of Corpo na Luna. And the best objective criterion that could be given is, can such a poetical and philosophical dialogue can it be translated in another act? And it will be done the 5th of August by the Grupo Corpo in the dance. the poetry can transmit his own way of feel happiness in this way, because because it animates this sensibility itself. It can be translated in show, in dance, as well as in this everyday philosophical reflection, who makes every artist competent.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to hear some voice, some sound. Thank you, Tania. Thank you, Jacques. And I pass the voice to Mika.
Yeah, guys, we have outside at 7 o'clock, so performance. Actually.